Judge, I have something I want you to see.
40 years. You don't just spend 40 years sitting behind a mahogany bench. You carry them. You carry every sigh, every tear, and every desperate look like a stone in your pocket until your gait changes and your soul feels heavy with the gravity of human struggle. After 4 decades, I thought I had developed a perfect armor. I thought my heart had become a fortress designed to process facts, apply the law, and remain untouched by the chaos of the lives passing before me. I've watched guilty men walk away with smirks, and I've watched fathers, good men, collapse in the hallway because a single mistake was about to cost them everything they loved. I've seen teenagers with eyes like hollowed out rooms, not because they were born bad, but because the world had never given them a reason to be good. 40 years of wait. It's thousands of lives, thousands of stories, and thousands of decisions that I take home every night, replaying them in the silence of my study. But nothing, no law book, no precedent, no lifetime of experience could have prepared me for that specific Thursday morning. It was one of those gray, relentless mornings in late autumn where the rain doesn't just fall, it clings to the tall, arched windows of the courthouse like it's trying to find a way inside. The air inside was thick with the smell of wet wool and floor wax, a scent that usually signals a long, difficult docket. I arrived at 8:15 sharp, as I always do. Habit is the only thing that keeps the weight from crushing you. Officer Miller held the door for me with a nod that spoke of 20 years of shared silence. We didn't need words. We both knew what this building demanded of a man. As I took my seat and adjusted my robe, I did what I always do. I scanned the room. You learn to read faces long before you open the case files. I saw the usual suspects of a municipal court: men tapping their feet in nervous rhythms, women clutching their purses like shields, and the weary eyes of those who had been through the system too many times. But then, my eyes stopped on the fourth row. There sat a man, perhaps in his mid-30s, his shoulders slumped like a bridge that had finally given way. Beside him was a young boy, no older than 6 or 7. The boy was dressed in a small, navy blue suit that looked a size too big, his hair combed flat with a precision that told me someone had taken great care to make him look important. But it wasn't his suit that caught my eye. It was what he held in his lap. His small, pale hands were folded tightly over a piece of paper, not a letter, but something thicker, something he guarded with a quiet, fierce intensity. He wasn't looking at the other people. He wasn't looking at the clock. He was looking directly at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, as if he were waiting for me to recognize him. At that moment, I felt a strange shift in the room, a silence that seemed to hum beneath the surface of the morning's business. I didn't know then that this boy was about to shatter the fortress I had spent 40 years building. The clock on the back wall ticked with a hollow, rhythmic sound that seemed to measure the heartbeat of everyone waiting for judgment in that crowded room. It was the sound of time running out for some, and the sound of a long, cold day beginning for others. Christina reached for the next file on her desk, her movements as precise and practiced as a surgeon's. She didn't look at me this time, but I noticed the way her hand lingered on the edge of the folder, a small gesture of hesitation I had learned to recognize over the decades. She cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the low murmur of the gallery, and called out the name, Samuel Vance. The man I had noticed earlier, the one with the slumped shoulders and the heavy gait, stood up slowly. He took the young boy's hand, and together they made that long, silent walk toward the podium. In a courtroom, that 20-foot walk can feel like 20 miles when you're carrying the weight of the unknown. As they approached the bench, I could see the details I'd missed from a distance. Samuel's suit was clean but visibly frayed at the cuffs, the kind of wear that comes from trying to hold on to dignity when everything else is slipping through your fingers. The boy, whose name I would soon learn was Leo, walked with a strange, stiff solemnity. He was dressed as if for a wedding or a funeral, his small shoes clicking rhythmically on the linoleum floor. He was still clutching that folded photo against his chest, his small knuckles white from the intensity of his grip. They stood before me, a father and a son, looking small against the high, dark wood of the bench. I opened the file and felt a familiar sink in my gut. It wasn't just a couple of parking tickets. It was a mountain of administrative violations, unpaid fines, and late fees that had compounded over nearly a year. To the system, it was just a balance sheet of debt. To the man standing in front of me, it was a cage he couldn't afford the key to. I looked over the rim of my glasses, trying to keep my expression neutral but fair. Mr. Vance, I began, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet hall. The court records show a significant outstanding debt here. Can you tell me, in your own words, what happened? Samuel didn't look away, and he didn't offer a scripted excuse. He just looked tired, the kind of tired that reaches into the bone and stays there. He explained that he had been working double shifts at a local shipping warehouse, often getting off in the early hours of the morning just to pick up Leo and drive him to a school at across town because they had lost their local housing. Every time he thought he had saved enough to settle one fine, the car would break down, or an emergency medical bill for Leo would arrive. He was running a race where the finish line was being moved further back every single day. I watched him as he spoke, and then I looked down at the boy, who was watching me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. He wasn't scared. He was waiting. The silence that followed Samuel's explanation wasn't the empty kind. It was heavy, filled with the unspoken exhaustion of a man who had been running on fumes for far too long. I've heard thousands of stories like his stories of good people trapped in the gears of a system that doesn't know how to be flexible. My eyes moved from the thick stack of papers in the file to the man standing there, his hands clasped in front of him as if he were bracing for a blow. But then, I felt a small movement at the edge of the podium. Leo, who had been standing as still as a statue, took a step forward. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't look at his father for a nod. He simply moved with a quiet, certain purpose that made every head in the gallery turn toward him. He looked up at the bench, and for the first time in 40 years, I felt like the high wood wasn't high enough to protect me from the honesty of a child. "Judge," he said, his voice small but remarkably steady. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the bench, and softened my tone. "Yes, Leo? What can I do for you?" The boy swallowed hard, his eyes never leaving mine. He slowly raised his hands, which were still protecting that folded piece of paper, as if it were a fragile bird. "I have something I want you to see," he whispered. He reached up, trying to extend his arm toward the top of the bench, but he was too small. I saw Christina start to move, but I held up a hand to stop her. I stood up from my chair, something I rarely do in the middle of a case, and reached down over the edge of the mahogany. My fingers brushed against his as he handed me the paper. It was thick, glossy photo paper, folded twice with such precision that the edges were sharp. It felt warm from being held against his chest for the last hour. As I sat back down and began to unfold it, a strange hush fell over the courtroom. The lawyers stopped whispering. The bailiff, who usually spent his time watching the clock, stood up straighter. It was one of those moments where the air seems to leave the room, leaving only the sound of paper crinkling in the hands of an old man. Samuel Vance looked down at his son, his face a mixture of confusion and terror, as if he were afraid of what his child might have done to make things worse. But Leo just stood there, his chin tilted up, watching my face with a look of pure, unshakable faith. He believed that if I just saw what he saw, everything would change. He believed in the fairness I was supposed to represent. I slowly opened the final fold, and for a long moment, I forgot how to breathe. I slowly opened the final fold of the photo Leo had handed me, and for a long moment, the air in the courtroom seemed to vanish entirely. The glossy surface caught the harsh glare of the overhead lights, revealing an image that no legal brief could ever capture. It wasn't a family portrait or a staged memory. It was a candid photograph, blurry and raw, taken through a window. It showed Samuel Vance slumped over the steering wheel of his car in the middle of the night, his face a mask of bone-deep exhaustion under the cold glow of a street lamp. In the passenger seat next to him, Leo was curled into a small, tight ball, using his tiny navy blue suit jacket as a makeshift pillow. The background was the dark, empty lot of the warehouse where Samuel worked his double shifts. I looked at the photo, then back at the file on my desk, which listed line after line of failure to move vehicle and overnight parking violations. To the city, these were just numbers, a way to generate revenue from the curb. To the man standing before me, these were the scars of his survival. This car wasn't just a means of transport. It had been their home on the nights the warehouse shifts ended too late, and the drive to their temporary housing felt too long. Paperwork tells you facts, but people tell you truth. I had always said. But I wasn't prepared for a truth this heavy. My throat tightened, and I felt a shift in my chest, a physical sensation of the walls I had built over 40 years finally beginning to crack. I realized then that Samuel wasn't asking for a handout. He was drowning in the very car that served as his only sanctuary. I took off my glasses, the weight of them suddenly feeling like a mountain, and I pressed my fingers against my eyes for just a second because I needed that second to breathe. I wasn't just a judge in that moment. I was a witness to a tragedy that the law wasn't designed to fix. When I looked back up, the courtroom was completely silent. Not a single sound came from the gallery. Dozens of people were frozen, watching my face, waiting to see if the authority I held was earned or merely performed. They weren't waiting for a ruling. They were waiting for emotional relief, a sign that the system could actually see them. Justice felt real in that silence because it was finally addressing what the people wanted, said that a man's struggle to provide for his child shouldn't be a crime. Samuel remained with his head bowed, but Leo never looked away from me. He had brought me the evidence of his father's goodness, and now he was waiting to see if I was fair enough to recognize it. I held the photo for what felt like an eternity, the glossy paper heavy with a truth that no courtroom reporter could ever transcribe. 40 years on this bench, and I had seen plenty of evidence, but I had never seen a man's exhaustion photographed so clearly by his own child. I looked at Samuel Vance, who was still standing there, his head bowed, as if waiting for a sentence that had already been passed by a life that gave him no breaks. He didn't see the photo I was holding. He only saw the mountain of debt he couldn't pay, and the system that seemed determined to bury him under it. I leaned forward, my voice catching in a way that 40 years of procedure usually prevented. "Mr. Vance," I said, and the courtroom seemed to lean in with me, the silence stretching so thin you could almost hear the heartbeat of the building. The law sees a car that didn't move. It sees violations of space and time. But this photo shows a father who hasn't stopped moving for a single second to take care of his son. I looked at Leo, who was still standing at the podium, his small hand resting on the dark, polished wood. "Leo, you told me earlier you had something I needed to see. You were right. This is the most important piece of evidence I've seen in a long time." I turned my gaze to the clerk, then back to the father, realizing that in this moment, authority was being performed not to punish, but to provide the emotional relief this family desperately needed. "Mr. Vance, we are in a house of law. But law without understanding is just a machine that grinds people down. Fairness is not just about the rules. It's about seeing the human being behind the mistake." I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the 40 years finally feeling lighter. I am dismissing every single one of these violations today. The fines, the late fees, the penalties, all of it, it is gone. The reaction in the room wasn't an outburst. It was a collective exhale, a release valve for a tension that had been building since the boy first stepped forward. Samuel Vance didn't cheer. He didn't even look up at first. He just closed his eyes, and I watched his shoulders, those slumped, weary shoulders, finally, slowly begin to rise. It was the look of a man who had been holding his breath for a year and finally found oxygen. Leo, however, did something else. He didn't look at the files or the clerk. He looked straight at me and gave a small, careful smile, the kind of smile that says, "A child's faith in justice has just been justified." He believed I was a good judge because his teacher said judges are fair, and for one morning in late autumn, I had to make sure that was the truth. After I spoke those words, dismissed, the air in the courtroom didn't just move, it transformed. It shifted from the gray, suffocating tint of legal anxiety to the bright, clear light of pure, unadulterated relief. I watched Samuel Vance closely. He didn't shout. He didn't pump his fist in the air. Instead, he did something far more powerful. He simply leaned his forehead against the cool, dark wood of the podium and let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped in his lungs for an entire year. It was the sound of a man being allowed to put down a burden that was never meant for his shoulders alone. I looked out at the gallery, and for the first time in 40 years, I saw something rare. Usually, the people waiting for their turn are restless, staring at their phones or checking the clock, desperate to leave this place of judgment. But not today. Today, they were frozen in a collective moment of grace. I saw an elderly woman in the back row, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. I saw a young man who had been scowling just minutes before, now looking at Samuel with a nod of quiet respect. Even the lawyers, men and women who usually trade only in the cold, hard currency of statutes and fine print, were looking on with expressions that were unmistakably human. In that moment, we weren't a room full of strangers, bound by municipal codes. We were a community, witnessing the simple, radical power of being seen. I turned my attention back to the father. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice low but carrying to every corner of the room, "I want you to take Leo home. I want you to get some rest. The city has enough money, but it can never have enough fathers like you." Samuel finally raised his head. His eyes were wet, but the hollow, haunted shadow that had darkened his face since he walked in was gone. His dignity, which had been frayed by months of struggling against an indifferent system, seemed to knit itself back together right before my eyes. He couldn't find the words to speak, and he didn't need to. He reached down and pulled Leo into a hug so fierce and so protective that it told the story of every double shift and every sleepless night better than any testimony ever could. Leo didn't pull away. He stood there in his little navy suit, his arms wrapped around his father's waist, looking back at me one last time. He didn't say thank you, because a child shouldn't have to thank the world for being fair. But the way he straightened his shoulders and looked at the photo still resting on my bench, the photo that proved his father was a hero, was the greatest verdict I had ever delivered. As they turned to walk back down the aisle, the gallery parted for them like they were royalty. I realized then that every person sitting in those rows was holding something heavy, a debt, a fear, a secret sorrow, and seeing Samuel's burden lifted made theirs feel just a little bit lighter. I sat back, the weight of my own 40 years on the bench suddenly feeling not like a load, but like a foundation for this single, perfect moment of justice. When the heavy oak doors of the courtroom finally swung shut and the last of the footsteps faded into the marble hallway, the silence that rushed in was different from any I had felt in 40 years. It wasn't the cold, hollow silence of an empty room. It was a lingering, vibrating presence, as if the walls themselves were still processing the truth they had just witnessed. I didn't go straight to my next case. I couldn't. I gathered my robes, picked up that folded photo from the bench, and walked slowly into my private chambers. I sat at my desk, the afternoon sun filtering through the blinds, casting long, barred shadows across the room that looked like the very prison Samuel Vance had been living in. I laid the photo down in front of me and just looked at it. In my 10 years of speaking to the American heart, especially those of you who have lived long enough to see the world change, I have learned one thing. The human face never lies if you know how to read the map. I looked at Leo's face in that blurry image, a child sleeping in a navy suit in a cold car. There is a concept in physiognomy, the study of a person's character from their outer appearance, that I've observed thousands of times. In Leo's eyes, even in that low-quality photo, there was a shen, or a spirit of absolute clarity. His eyes weren't clouded by the cynicism that we adults carry like a shield. They were wide, unblinking, and piercingly honest. He didn't look at me as a judge with a title. He looked at me as a human being with a choice. It was his gaze that stripped away my 40 years of armor and reminded me why I put on this robe in the first place. His small, firm chin and the steady set of his shoulders showed a bone of integrity that many grown men lack. He wasn't just a child. He was a guardian of his father's dignity. I thought about the thousands of others out there, the Samuels and the Leos parked in the shadows of our great American cities, working double shifts, sleeping in their cars, and being penalized for the crime of trying to survive. We often mistake poverty for a lack of character, but that photo proved the opposite. It was a portrait of the highest form of character, sacrifice. I realized that day that justice isn't a formula you find in a law book. It's a living, breathing thing that requires us to look past the violations and see the vibrations of the human soul. I had spent decades looking at files, but Leo forced me to finally look at the people. I reached for a small wooden frame I kept in the corner of my desk. I took out the generic landscape photo that had been there for years and replaced it with Leo's crumpled image. I wanted it there, not as a trophy, but as a compass, It was a reminder that the smallest voice in the room is often the only one speaking the truth we need to hear. Every time I look at that small wooden frame on my desk, I don't just see a blurry photograph. I see a promise. I see a promise that as long as we are willing to listen, justice will never be a cold, dead thing. That day with Leo and Samuel Vance didn't just change their lives, it permanently altered the DNA of my courtroom. I realized that after 40 years, I wasn't just there to interpret the law. I was there to protect the human spirit that the law is supposed to serve. To my friends watching at home, those of you who have raised families, built your own businesses, and seen the seasons of this great country change, you know better than anyone that the true strength of America isn't found in the height of our buildings or the complexity of our legal codes. It is found in the quiet, bone-deep persistence of a father who refuses to let his circumstances define his character. It is found in the fierce, unshakable loyalty of a 7-year-old boy who believes, against all odds, that the world will be fair if he just speaks the truth. As I look toward the day I will finally hang up this black robe, I know that my legacy won't be measured by the thousands of fines I collected or the technicalities I upheld. My legacy will be those few moments when I had the courage to put down the gavel and pick up the human story. I want my successor to sit in this chair and remember that fairness is not a static destination. It is a choice we make every single morning when we decide to look a person in the eye instead of just looking at their file. Before you click away today, I want to leave you with one thought. We live in a world that often feels loud, divided, and indifferent. But as Leo taught me, the smallest voice in the room can shatter the thickest walls if it is powered by love. If this story touched something deep inside you, if it reminded you of the goodness that still exists in our neighbors and our strangers, then I ask you to share it, not for the views, but for the reminder that we are all holding something heavy, and a little bit of understanding goes a long way. Thank you for allowing me to share this journey with you. Thank you for believing in a justice system that still has a heart. If you want to join our community and see more stories where humanity takes the lead, please subscribe and stay with us on this journey. Because, as my father used to say, the world runs on the small things people do when nobody's watching, and today we all watched something beautiful. I am Judge Boyd. Look at the person, not just the file. God bless you, and I'll see you in the next case.